She was born to power and condemned by pedigree, a princess whose own blood became the sentence that would shape a continent. Madrid, 1672. In the glitter of a court that still claimed to define Europe, a child arrived with the weight of a dynasty stitched into her linens. Her name was Isabel de Solis, and today we will uncover how customs meant to protect a throne turned a life into a warning, and how private infirmities echoed into public crisis. Join me as we trace the tapestries, the portraits, and the bedside whispers that reveal the human cost of dynastic obsession. The palace bells rang like accusation as her cradle rocked, and the portraits that would later fix her face in oil could not hide the fevered nights that followed. In this story we will meet rulers, painters, doctors, and diplomats whose pens and diagnoses decided more than borders. We will see how art, medicine, and marriage were strands of the same fate. The House of Castilla had long claimed descent from medieval kings and saints, and had grown into what contemporaries called a sealed family. Over generations, marriages were instruments of policy, alliances written in vows and sealed in churches, and consanguinity became a chosen risk to keep titles and lands intact. By the mid-17th century, the court was a map of kinship with its own logic. King Fernando IV insisted on kin matches to secure inland holdings. Queen Beatrice, anxious and devout, argued that purity of blood strengthened claims. Archbishop Mateo advised that marriages within the house preserve the sacrament of succession. Ambassadors such as Ruiz recorded these meetings in dispatches, noting always the same refrain, that a throne must not slip beyond the line. The dynasty's diplomats negotiated treaties with the same language used at family councils. Portrait painters like Alonso and even itinerant artists influenced by Velázquez filled chapel walls with images of infants swaddled in gold, symbols of continuity as much as status. Yet beneath brocades and courtly music, there were reports that troubled the king's advisors. Children born with weak jaws, heirs who failed to thrive, a tendency among cousins who married to bear fragile bodies and trembling minds. The court did not call it by the name modern physicians would later use. They spoke of frailty, of heirs, of a temperament that needed prayers and careful diet. But archives reveal lists of births and deaths, and the pattern was undeniable. The dynasty had traded genetic resilience for political stability. Letters from Ambassador Ruiz to the French envoy described a household that smelled of orange oil and stale wax, where nurses hushed crying infants and doctors held their noses at persistent fevers. The discourse at council was not only theological and strategic, but also increasingly medical. The word in some private notes was inbreeding. In other pages, it was consanguinity. Neither term was aired in public beyond euphemism, but the effect was visible. Succession plans shifted, regency councils were imagined, and that the concept of an unassailable heir became brittle. The cost had faces. One brother, the young Archduke Matteo Fernando, developed a speech so slurred that courtiers pretended not to notice, and tutors tried, in a hush, to teach him Latin. Lady Catalina, a governess, wrote in her journal of rasping coughs, of a child whose hands trembled like leaves. Dr. Serrano recorded physical anomalies in a ledger where ink smudged with sweat, a narrow palate, a heart that misbehaved, fevers that returned like unwelcome guests. These were not mere statistics. They were cries in bedrooms and empty cradles that left Queen Beatrice sleepless and the king staring at maps he could not redraw. Noble families whispered, some offering sympathy and others discreetly calculating alternatives. Duke Alvarez and Count Ruiz debated a marriage alliance with an outside house, while whispers reached the ears of the queen that any break in lineage might invite foreign claimants. The cost became political when advisors realized that repeated infant mortality and weak heirs left the throne vulnerable to regencies, to factionalism, and to treaties that might ignore Castilia's interests. It was a human tragedy at scale, with doctors and ambassadors, painters and priests all witnesses to the slow erosion of what had seemed unassailable. If this reality feels cold, consider the smell of the sick room, the soft rattle of breath, the trembling of a mother's hand on linen, and the gilded portraits that never told the whole story. If this part of the story already moved you, know that these tensions inspired fierce debate among people who lived and wrote the minutes of history. What struck you most in this portrait of power and fragility? Was it the relentless ambition of the family or the burden of medical ignorance at the time? Type just ambition or health below to tell me what you think. I read every comment and sometimes bring your theories into future episodes. Your words shape how we investigate and reinterpret the past. Now let us return to Isabel and to the details of a childhood that would concentrate the dynasty's contradictions into a single fragile person. Isabel's backstory reveals how upbringing became a crucible. As a child, she learned to read under cold candlelight, the pages smelling faintly of glue and lemon rind. Tutors like Maestro Alonso drilled genealogy until the syllables tasted of iron and ink. In rooms lined with tapestries, her footsteps were softened by velvet, yet she grew used to solitary meals where the roast was too hot to touch and the stew always lacked salt, because servants feared upsetting royal protocols. She had a small hand that loved the brush as much as the needle. In the afternoons, she painted with a visiting artist, Alonso the Younger, who taught her how to blend umber and lead white into flesh tones. Her voice, when she laughed, filled the gallery with a brittle sound that courtiers praised as demure, while housemaids called it a shiver of nerves. The queen ensured. Isabel learned French and Latin, but also the rituals of etiquette that mattered more than play. As adolescence approached, the palace noises hardened. The measured step of the captain of the guard on the marble corridor, the metallic click of the chests as diplomats arrived with documents bound in red wax, the faint scent of incense in the chapel where she knelt at dusk. Her childhood was neither pauper nor indulgence. It was structured and sensory, full of silk against her skin, candle smoke at windows, the tang of lemon tarts at feast days, and the bitter coffee that nobles sipped in morning councils. These details mattered because they shaped how she would respond when power required a sacrifice. The more she learned of maps and succession laws, the less room she had to imagine a private life apart from dynastic calculations. In quiet moments, she wrote a journal in ink that smelled of iron, confiding to the page the fear that her body might betray the very house she was meant to fortify. In the Great Council, the marriage debate unfolded like an interrogation. Ambassador Ruiz presented a treaty. Duke Alvarez tapped his cane on the table. Queen Beatrice folded her hands, and King Fernando asked questions that tasted of duty rather than tenderness. "We must secure a line," said Archbishop Mateo solemnly. "A union with an archduke ensures allies," countered Duke Alvarez. "But what if the children do not thrive?" whispered Dr. Serrano. "Then we must prepare regency plans," replied Count Ruiz briskly. "The crown cannot depend on hope," the king said, with a voice like distant thunder. Isabel sat at the edge of council, her silk dress rustling, hearing the scrape of quills and the soft thud of sealed letters landing on the table. "What do you say, Isabel?" asked Queen Beatrice gently, more a ritual than a question. "I would serve the house," she answered, though her mouth tasted of iron and foreboding. "Can you live away from your mother?" pressed Ambassador Ruiz. "I will try," she said, fingers tracing the rim of a goblet that left a cold ring on velvet. The negotiation continued in practical tones until a final pact was signed. This scene had dialogue punctuated by softer, private exchanges that revealed anxiety rather than certainty. The smells were citrus and wax, the sounds a chorus of whispered strategies, the sight a room of faces composed like carved marble. The decision to marry into a related branch seemed inevitable to those who counted titles and points on a genealogical chart. Departure to the foreign court marked a second tension that would define her marriage. At the docks, Isabel hugged Lady Catalina, who pressed the faint perfume of lavender into her hair and said, "Remember who you are." Isabel clutched the fabric of the mantle and answered, "I will." On the ship, the salt stung their lips, gulls circled, and the wood beneath them creaked like an old argument. She arrived in a colder, court where tapestries smelled of damp wool and firewood, and the Archduke, a distant cousin named Philip of Lorraine, greeted her with formal courtesy. "Welcome, princess," he said, his voice polite but distant. "Thank you," she replied, tasting stew that lacked the bright citrus of home. Their conversations were ceremonial at first. "The council expects heirs," the Archduke told her in a corridor lined with soldiers, the metal of their halberds chiming softly. "So do I," she answered, though the words sat heavy in a chest already marked by recurring fevers and dizziness. Life in the new court was full of tactile and olfactory details. The scratch of heavy wools, the metallic tang of coins, the sweet lacquer used on furniture that left the air thick in late afternoons. Children were expected, and the palace prepared, but births were followed by a hush, then mourning. The second moment of tension came with consecutive pregnancies and losses. Courtiers whispered. The painter Alonso returned one winter to paint a cradled portrait and found the nursery drained of color. The dialogues here were fragmented, many more than casual. Midwives spoke in clipped sentences. Doctors argued over poultices and diets. The queen wrote letters pleading for prayers. "She must eat more," urged Dr. Serrano. "She cannot," Isabel murmured, the taste of metal in her mouth. This back and forth repeated until the rhythm of expectation and grief became the court's new music. 3 moments defined the arc of decline and must be told in detail. The first came when a child, brief as a candle flame, came alive for a single day and then was gone. The room smelled of rosewater and clean linen. The nurse Amelia sat with fingers numb from petitioning physicians. Dr. Serrano checked the infant's breath and said, "It is fragile." Queen Beatrice knelt with a rosary pressed to the lips, whispering, "Forgive us," while outside the palace bells tolled a low and accusing note. The second moment was a political crisis when rival nobles suggested a foreign regency. Count Ruiz, with voice thin and sharp, declared in a council meeting, "We cannot leave an infant crown to chance." And Duke Alvarez retorted, "Nor can we invite foreign influence." The conversation rose and fell like surf. Courtiers, smelling smoke from torches, watched while Isabel listened, hands cold on a velvet chair. The third moment was her final illness. Night after night, the bedsheets retained the faint lemon of the royal laundress. Her skin felt like cold silk, and coughs rasped like old rope. Dr. Serrano performed rudimentary examinations, and later a post-mortem, noting abnormalities in heart and jaw. An autopsy written in a dry official hand that would be preserved in the royal archive. Her last exchanges were short and intimate. "Isabel," whispered Lady Catalina, as dawn slipped through the shutters like a thin blade. "Forgive me if I failed," she said, voice gone to dust. "You were what you were told to be," Isabel answered, breath shallow, smelling faintly of camphor and honey. These 2 brief paragraphs compress the sensory and emotional detail that made her decline both medical and emblematic of a dynasty that could not outgrow its own rules. The funeral procession was enormous and careful, a choreography of loss and legitimacy. The cortege moved through streets where citizens gathered, the smell of incense from the speaker's chapel blending with smoke from torches, and the portrait that had once adorned palace walls now draped in black cloth. King Fernando walked with a gait altered by grief, Queen Beatrice with a face set like parchment, Archbishop Matteo intoning prayers whose syllables seemed to weigh heavier than usual. In the immediate aftermath, succession talks intensified. Letters from foreign courts arrived with veiled concern and interest. Historians later would point to these months as the moment when the dynasty's fragility became policy that others could exploit. The autopsy, recorded in a clinician's hand, was both a medical note and a political document. It named congenital weaknesses, it suggested that royal marriages had compounded hereditary problems, and it prompted debates among physicians, priests, and statesmen about whether bloodlines had been defended at the cost of children. The immediate consequence was the reorganization of regency councils and a subtle shift towards seeking outside alliances even at the price of diluting pure lineage. In the long term, her life mattered beyond the grief it caused. Artists kept her visage in oil as a symbol of a vanished innocence. The portrait now hangs in a provincial museum where visitors still read the plaque and see a face whose cheeks hint at pallor. Historians and modern geneticists would later use letters and death registers to argue that prolonged consanguinity among ruling houses contributed to a pattern of frailty that altered succession plans across several reigns. Courts learned to balance the desire for dynastic purity with the pragmatic need for robust heirs, and treaties began to factor in the health of prospective lines as well as their territorial value. The lesson, harsh and human, is that institutions that close themselves off may protect titles for a generation and jeopardize them for the next. If this story surprised you, leave a comment below with a single word ambition or health to tell me which you think mattered most. I read your responses and they inform future episodes. If you want more histories that blend art, diplomacy, and personal tragedy, subscribe to the channel for well-documented narratives and join a community that discusses the past with respect. Isabel's memory became both memorial and cautionary tale. She was a child who learned Latin and needlework and yet became an emblem of a policy that put pedigree above person. The dynasty endured, but its strategies shifted in the century that followed. In private journals, in archived autopsy notes, and in the careful strokes of painters who tried to render both dignity and sorrow, her life remained as a reminder that power bears a cost. History is not only a ledger of treaties and coronations, it is also a ledger of small deaths at bedside, of lullabies cut short, and of portraits that could not keep the living safe. If this story moved you, write ambition or health below, and consider subscribing so we can continue to examine the fragile lives behind the flags and the maps. Remember, the past teaches not to pity, but to understand, that the price of stability can be paid in human terms. Isabel's life is one such price.